Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda sedang menonton Agenda Awani. Dan hari ini, Agenda Awani ingin melihat ke masa depan, bukan beramal, tapi menganalisis dan menganalisa tentang apa yang kita ada sekarang dan apa yang kita boleh nampak untuk masa depan. Pakar-pakarnya ada bersama dengan saya. Terasnya adalah inovasi, tapi isinya itu yang kita nak bincangkan hari ini. I would like now to speak in English because I have a very, very honoured guest. I have Patrick Harris, the co-founder of Future Agenda. If you look and Google about him, he's an expert on many things. Digital stuff, looking into the future of many things, education. But today I want to start with the future of companies. And because of that, I would like to thank Azim Pawanching, as usual, the Managing Director of Alpha Catalyst Consulting. He was so gracious enough to, in his own company's expenses, to bring this discussion to KL. I missed the session, that's why I forced them to be here on Agenda Awani. Thinking about the future of companies, what would happen to companies 10 years from now, for example. And that's what Patrick Harris and the group of people that he has galvanized around him has been doing. And they have been talking about many things 10 years in the future. And I think that started in 2010 and look at 2020. We'll come to that.
Yes,
but
of course.
Because you're the guest of the country, so I'm going to start with you first. I was at an event for ASEAN where one panelist said, because he came from overseas and he wrote the book, and he was talking about the exponential organization, and he was saying that in maybe 10 years' time, 60% of the future of the Fortune 500 companies will not be there anymore. And the number of Fortune 500 companies that were existing in the 90s is drastically down compared to which one is still around. So if things are changing, what do we look at for 10 years from now as far as the companies are concerned? Because for me, it's not even about the companies, it's about the world that is changing. For example, the issue of the bottom 40% has always been looked upon. Who has to help these poor people? It will have to be the governments. But that's no longer doable. Under any measure, society, civil society at that, they are asking for companies who have so much resources and profit to do more. Because it's not just about the profit and loss anymore. But maybe that's me blabbering on. How do you see it 10 years from now for companies?
Thank you. It's a very good question. And I probably should say that while you might seem as an expert on many topics, I'm probably better as an expert at grabbing other people's opinions on many topics. And so I think what happened and what has happened in some of our conversations on the future of the company is several issues that companies might face. The one about inequality I'll come to in just a minute, maybe last. But issues that companies see are technical problems. So how can we survive in a technical revolution?
Okay.
Because what that is doing is disintermediating the way business is done.
Positive disruption.
Yes.
And negative one.
Yes, exactly. So the examples that are constantly given are Airbnb and Uber. And those are organizations that don't own assets. What they do is instead they match a given need or a need that's out there with unused assets. There's nothing owned, there's nothing for the company, it's all done remotely. And so this disintermediation is leading to a large number of freelancers, a large number of people doing their own thing, not necessarily interested in a 9-to-5 job or even an employment contract anymore.
If that is the case, then structures of institutions will be the first one, among others, to be tested and to be rethink. For example, I've always been wondering, why is it that Apple, for example, technology company like that, have a concentric circle of the org chart?
Yes.
The chart that defines the organization.
Yes.
Because they want the layers to be flatter. And if I'm the CEO, I cut across the outer layer, maybe 3 or 4 layers only, rather than the traditional hierarchical one. So do you see that happening? Why aren't more companies acknowledging this and straight away changing into the needs of the 21st century? Is it only historical baggages or more than that?
I think you're right. I think the structure of the company is front line. It's where the battles will start to take place. And why would anyone want to be a part of an organization? And if they do join an organization, how long might they stay there? So the idea of a job for life is obviously not in our heads anymore.
No, I'm going to give the tougher question to Azim because put that in the Malaysian and ASEAN context, because sometimes it's easy to talk about the global scenario, but we have to look in the mirror, look at ourselves and our ecosystem.
Yes.
I think that's painful truth there.
During the discussion yesterday, I think there were about 20 over people. One of the key issue which came out is the issue of hierarchy within Asian organization, between Malaysian organization. I think based on research done, I think Malaysia has got the highest level of power distance. That means the gap between the top management and the lower level is huge. So what we see in the future, things are changing very fast, and sometimes people who is in the front line is the one seeing the need for change, the need for innovation, but somehow this message is not being cascaded on top. So what we discussed yesterday was about the need for a new way of managing, the need to break down the cultural barrier, people to express themselves, to try to think of new things. So that's where we
I always
see.
like to disrupt Azim, because he always talks about innovation. So let me come at that point from the layman's perspective, because okay, let me get this right. If I'm a layman, I'm the lowest level of employee, and the company has been like that for decades.
Yes.
Why would I hope for the same SLT to suddenly wake up in the morning, I will change the structure of my company? It has not been working. Of course, it wouldn't be like that. It's still the same SLT, senior leadership team. So, if we talk about change, who will initiate this change? What forces will make this change happen?
Okay. I think in Malaysia, there's a lot of realization that there's a lot of disruption at hand. So we've seen board coming to the picture. I know one bank, actually the board is actually driving innovation of the bank. So what's happening is that the top instrument, the SLT, actually providing channels for the younger generation to spend time with them, understanding their needs, even providing direct ideas for them. So they bypass the layers in between. So we see that as a progressive step. The other thing that I saw is a lot of the government-linked companies, GLC, actually creating roles of Chief Innovation Officer. And their job is to actually allow ideas from the companies to emerge from everywhere.
Cool. Let's go for the first break. I want to take that up further, because if all the examples that you give, they didn't come from the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Sometimes they come from a wannabe graduate from an Ivy League university who decided that I have better things to do, quit their studies and just do it. So if innovation is being driven from the board and the leadership of the company, where does that match the trend of the 21st century? Because more and more innovation is coming from the grassroots. How do we reconcile that? We'll discuss that after this short break. Still watching Agenda Wani, we're still talking about the future, and you might want to Google Future Agenda, because Patrick Harris has so many stuff that you can learn and read about. But I'm going to take a bit of the trajectory on the first segment, and if innovation is coming up more and more from the grassroots, because I think it's no coincidence that all the things that we're seeing now is because the widespread pervasiveness of ICT and social media, which enables any single individual now to be so empowered to match things, to grow new ideas. But how do we reconcile that with also the power and the resources still allocated to, in the traditional corporate structure, the higher leadership? Because it needs to gel and it needs to be harmonized.
I think there might be 2 or 3 ways that's trying to happen these days. I do think corporates are better at listening to what is happening at grassroots and bringing those thoughts into the organization, so their ability to incubate and to spin off ideas and to treat them separately so that different characteristics can foster inside those activities is happening. I think organizations are good at listening to the crowd. So there are wonderful examples where a 12-year-old in Texas can change the ingredients inside a canned drink. And suddenly the canned drink mix changes for all of its competitors as well. It doesn't take much time, just someone tweeting about it. But perhaps the biggest change, which is about the marriage of bottom-up and top-down, if you like, of innovation, is how organizations start to build models that incorporate the sharing economy.
Okay.
And again, those examples that were mentioned even in our workshop just yesterday, examples of how Airbnb and Uber are doing that on a very, very good basis.
As in, sometimes when we listen like to that, and we think that's the way to go, but when we go out back into the reality of what we have in Malaysia and ASEAN, we don't see that much. It's maybe happening here and there, but we want it to be the mainstream, not the alternative.
Well, one of the challenges that organization is facing in Malaysia is that the pressure to change is there, but they know where they need to change, but the willingness to take risks is not there. So I've seen a lot of companies setting up incubators, trying to work with startups, but there's insufficient funding coming to help scale or prototype what they call that, the solution. So the shift which needs to happen is that in organizations in Malaysia, for example, they need to create specific funds that allows for the organization to take risks, even coming up with their own internal innovation funds. So that's where I see the trend should be happening. So the issue lies with short term versus long term, because the company is focusing on short term gains, so they're only looking at projects where the ROI is achievable within 1 to 2 years, but in most cases it takes 3 to 5 years before something.
But they have AGMs every year, so the pressure to go, be in front and take questions from even minority shareholders, for example. Maybe these are the ritual and processes that needs to adapt and change too.
I think so. I think it's a chance to organizations and other institutions to tap into the basic group of society that can start to have greater influence. Something we've seen in other workshops, so outside of our company workshop for a minute, is conversations around inequality, but on a grand scale. So sometimes we talk about inequality with regards to, say, wealth or data or access to technology or access to transport. But access to decision-making is also something that's starting to rise. And so those that often need services of organizations or services of institutions or services of government aren't always able to influence. And the asset class, who are often able to influence the organization or the institution or the government, aren't always in touch with what the needs are.
What's your idea or view of social enterprise? Because that's supposed to be the new movement that marries the need to make wealth and profit, but also doing good, not later, but by the very DNA of the company.
So when you introduced our conversation today, you talked about how it's no longer, we can no longer rely on government to fill the gap. And I think that business is realizing it has a role to play there. It's still in its nascent state today, so we don't have many organizations building social enterprises, but we do have some good examples of it. And the best description I've heard of that is in one of the conversations where it was said that the success of organizations has become disconnected from the success of society. And that particular conversation was about banking, which is absolutely true. Banks can be enormously successful, but not necessarily helping society be successful.
Is there a marked difference between the future of companies in the West, in the more developed nations, as compared to Asia that you have seen?
I'm not sure that I can comment on Asia, but I can say that I have seen some information very recently about a reduction all around the world on the number of limited companies being formed. That's less prevalent in Asia as it is in the West. So in other words, there are different types of enterprises being formed more prolifically in the West than here, but nevertheless the trend is still happening.
What I see, a huge difference in terms of, for example, labor practices. In Asia, it's a norm that you stay back late. 8, 9 o'clock.
Tell us about it.
But in Paris, they just came out with a law that it's illegal for certain sectors to work after 6. So you can't apply certain rules, which is a norm in a more developed country to Asia, including environmental laws, emission laws, because we are not ready, we don't have natural resources to work with it yet. In fact, one of the conversations which emerged yesterday, for example, do Malaysian companies abide to EU standards? But it's not fair. What if the neighboring country is not abiding to the standards? So we will lose our edge, our costs will be more. However, one company in the discussion said they had to do it, even though it's making them lose money, because that's what their customer in Europe wants.
That's what I want to go later, after the last break that we're going to go into. Because, for example, if you take palm oil, it's very important for ASEAN, but people in London will say they don't want to eat anything that's made out of palm oil because it's killing the orangutans, for example. So this kind of equation, whether you like it or not, even though it's so far away from you, will determine where your company stands in the future. And education has a big role to influence that, because it's more globalized. How do I look at issues? Those are the value drivers. I'll discuss that, because without looking at the environment around companies, how could we discuss companies? So we're going to go to the ecosystem right after this. There's never enough time for a great discussion, and I just want to speed this up by asking Patrick in an instance that let's look at the future of education also, because companies will have to look at the consumers and the community around it. And I think education nowadays are producing very different kind of students and talents into the market, if you like to call it the market, or into society.
Yes. The two are very much related. Like you say, when you reach the workplace, maybe you're less interested in a professional occupation and maybe just want to do what you think you can do well. And that's certainly true in education prior, because what we're seeing in all of our conversations is a focus where it's not so much what you know, more about do you have the ability to access and utilize knowledge. And if you can do that, once you start to make that happen, then you can be whatever you need to be. The prevalence of badges, whether those are A-levels or international baccalaureates or degrees, the presence of badges, or even in some cases professional degrees, is much less important for a whole generation of people.
So you're very confident that knowledge economy will really be where we are in at the moment, right now, into the future?
Not only that, yes, of course, very confident about that. And I also think there's a byproduct that comes with this increased connectivity, which is driving all of this. And it's something that was said in one of our conversations in Dubai, and we were bizarrely talking about energy at the time. But someone finally said, with a bit of pressing, because they were thinking about what could we say that is big and different. And the conversation was, we are gradually becoming conscious stewards. And we're more aware of not just what we do in our lives and in our schools, in our companies, but also in the environment around us. And that ability to be a conscious steward came out of, I think, the connectivity that we have, which drives this ability to know what you need to know for a given situation.
So we need to rethink our universities, our high schools, our primary schools, our preschools.
Absolutely.
Because I think it was Bill Gates who said that high schools are obsolete. You know? And these are the things, I mean, maybe they don't mean that literally, but everything has to change.
Well, you could mean it literally if you're talking about the UK, which is something I know a bit more than, say, Malaysia, because our schools came from two particular building generations. One was a Victorian world, and one was a post-World War II world. And those structures simply can't be right today. In some of our workshops, I found it quite comical when we walked into not the workshop yesterday, I should add, but in some of our workshops, we walk into a space and we want to rearrange the space to suit the kind of conversation we have. And what we find is that the lectern cannot be moved. So institutions, educational institutions, are still thinking that it needs to be a professor in the front behind a lectern telling students what to do. And that's hardly the case.
Kamarojat, to expand further, because I don't think it's about being in knowledge economy, it's about the ability to use knowledge. I think universities, schools, they are no longer about you gaining facts, it's about you gaining the right mindset to apply the knowledge, to experiment and quickly look for any new information. You talk about with YouTube, you can practically learn anything in an instant. So degree courses is irrelevant. I've been spoken to many people, 90% will say they are only using 1% of what they've learned in the university. But what's more important is the discipline which come in terms of thinking process, analyzing information, self-confidence in there. So what I think in the future, when you are looking for a job candidate, it's not what's your degree, what is your portfolio of projects you've done, what are your failures, what's the experiments that you've done in the past. That's a better predictor than what degree that you take. Yeah.
That's very exciting because if you look at any writings on talent, global talent, they're saying that this side of the world, the Asian countries, the future is there because the more developed Western countries has trouble filling up key positions that they're looking at because the younger, more fluid and mobile talents are on this side of the world. So if this side of the world is going to take over and helm a lot of leadership in the companies of the future, so do you see a very different way that is going to be run? Because the big barometer benchmark for this is the debate about when is China going to overtake the US, for example, in the leadership of the world? Because people feel that if China's the one leading it, the world, it will be a very different world.
I think when the conversation is had about East versus West, I think it's a very limited conversation to my mind, where we almost always talk about global economic impact. And we rarely talk about global cultural impact.
Okay.
And I think the global cultural impact will be massive. One tiny example from, again, some of our conversations is what happened in Hong Kong when we were discussing education. And one of the key findings there was bold statements about the fact that the current generation of senior school students are being exposed to liberal arts.
Okay.
What happens when we take a number of liberal arts students who, in 10 years' time, which is the period we're talking about, and they're going to be in power? What will they want? What kinds of things will they want, and how will they go about achieving them?
And put that against the technological advancement, which means somebody was telling me yesterday that you might not need mid-level management anymore in companies because there will be apps and software and whatever doing it.
Yes. Yeah, so I still use a laptop and I still use email, and it's incorrect, isn't it? I should be using more apps because that's where all the conversations take place. People are accessing the internet on mobile phones more than they are other devices. It is the device of the future.
Azim, wrap this up for us for here in ASEAN, because sometimes it's frightening to talk about all this and looking out there of where we are at right now.
Yes.
But I guess with innovation, it's not where you are at. Where do you want to go and how do you want to get there?
I think based on a lot of statistics, innovation is indeed moving to Asia. Number of patents is on the rise. We have giants coming out from China, etc. But what needs to happen is Asian countries needs to work closely together, especially between Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, because a lot of the needs which is coming from Asia needs to be developed by Asians because we understand what we need. But do we have the courage to try and do it?
Done deal. You have to come back, Patrick, for another discussion. There's a lot more 10 years from now that he has been writing about, but I don't have the time to grill him on everything. Thanks so much, Azim, as usual. Always making us think. Terima kasih banyak kepada anda telah menonton. Hantarkan pandangan anda sendiri tentang inovasi ataupun apa jua pada pelbagai platform yang Astro Awani ada, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube dan sebagainya. Ataupun muat turun aplikasi Mudah Alih iOS dan Android supaya anda boleh menonton episod seperti ini secara langsung di gadget Mudah Alih kegemaran anda. Sekian, selamat malam. Terima kasih. Jumpa lagi. Thank you so much.